For today's meditation, let us read from 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 6 to 23. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of Medes. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree, and there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger, and they served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I had commanded your fathers, that I sent to you by my servants the prophets." But they would not listen, but were stubborn as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. And they made an Asherah and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. And they burnt their sons and their daughters as offerings and used divination and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Judah also did not keep the commandments of their Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of sight. When God executes judgment, the consequences are stark and sobering. The story of Israel's final days as a kingdom is recorded in this chapter. The downfall of Israel under the reign of Hoshea, the last king, reminds us of what happens when a nation repeatedly rejects God's mercy and guidance. The cumulative rebellion of Israel over generations brought about its ruin, rather than Hoshea's evil reign alone. Here we see God in judgment. Despite great patience and countless warnings, he is finally moved to carry out justice. Consider God's astounding patience. For 200 years, he bore with the people of the northern kingdom, Samaria, after the split from Judah during the time of Rehoboam, son of Solomon. Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes, deliberately and as a matter of policy, led Israel into idolatry. He erected 2 golden calves and told the people that they were images of the Lord who had led them out of Egypt and into Canaan. He turned the hearts of the people away from their God. 19 kings followed Jeroboam in Israel, but none were like David, whose heart was unfailingly turned towards God. Many did worse than Jeroboam, deepening the nation's sin. A few, like Jehu, began with good intentions, but they too faltered when godly influences faded. Despite their continual rebellion, God waited. 2 centuries passed, filled with countless opportunities for repentance. God's patience was matched by his mercy. Over these years, he sent prophets to warn his people of their evil ways. Think of Elijah, Elisha, Hosea, Amos, Micah, and Jonah. These are the mighty men of God who faithfully proclaimed his truth. They called out the grave sins of Israel, idolatry, immorality, and injustice. They constantly urged Israel to return to the Lord. There were schools of prophets from the time of Samuel onwards. These men continued to share God's warnings. These messengers abundantly demonstrated God's unwillingness to let his people perish. Day and night, like a slave, God labored to turn his people's heart back to himself so that they might live and not die. Throughout Israel's history, God chastened them, often very sharply. When the Israelites entered the promised land, it was clear that their victories were solely due to his presence and power. He repeatedly encouraged their reliance on him so that they might conquer and dwell peacefully in the land. Yet they chose to walk in their own ways. During the time of the judges and beyond, God handed them over to their enemies when they strayed, only to deliver them when they cried out in repentance. These cycles of sin, judgment, and deliverance are appalling reminders of human short-sightedness and ingratitude. However, as this chapter explains, Israel reached a point where their sins filled the measure of God's wrath. The reasons for their desolation are laid bare in the text. They flouted the God who redeemed them from Egypt. They made idols for themselves like the nations around them. They worshipped idols both secretly and openly, forsaking the Lord's covenant and rejecting their master. They refused to heed the repeated warnings through God's prophets, mocking and scoffing at their messages. All too soon they abandoned God altogether in favor of lifeless idols. Judgment was inevitable. This chapter serves as a profound commentary on human unfaithfulness. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 15 and 16, Judah is shown to have reached the same nadir before their exile to Babylon. In strikingly similar terms, it describes their condition. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. What does this mean for us today? First, we must recognize that the blessings, protections, and provisions we enjoy are not because of our human wisdom and strength. Simply, God has placed a hedge around us. He guards us from dangers seen and unseen. How grateful we should be to him. How deeply we should feel our dependence on him. Second, God's mercy is abundant. He welcomes back anyone who turns back to him. No matter how far we have strayed, his arms remain open to repentant sinners. He is a God of second chances. Yet, we dare not take his grace for granted by walking in sin. When God speaks to us through his word, through sermons, or through godly counsel of others, we must listen carefully and respond obediently. Let us not dismiss these moments as mere coincidences. Let us recognize them as divine interventions meant to realign our hearts with his will. Third, we need to stop and consider our ways when faced with roadblocks and setbacks. When challenges arise, whether through illness, financial difficulties, or strained relationships, it is wise to pause and examine our hearts. God is getting our attention, urging us to listen to him. As Proverbs 28:14 reminds us, blessed is the one who fears the Lord always, but whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. Finally, we must never forget that the God of abundant patience and mercy is also a consuming fire. Hebrews 10 verse 31 warns us that it is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. His holiness includes love and righteousness. His eyes are too pure to look upon the sin in the midst of his people. To treat his patience lightly is to invite judgment upon ourselves. Let us learn from the dreadful story of Israel's end. They were forced to leave the beautiful land and become wanderers without a king, a temple, or a land. Let us recognize God's urgent call. Let us commit to walking with the Lord by faith. Let us hear his voice and obey him, eager to do what he says and turning away from ungodliness. Our lives of faith and obedience are the only way that we can truly honor the God who redeems, sustains, and lovingly calls us back to himself. God bless.